Well, as Jesus comes to this final moment in his earthly life, we come to the end of this series that we've been talking about, 48 hours to save the world. And that's because at the beginning of the 14th chapter of Mark's gospel, it said there's 2 days to the Passover, 2 days, 24 hours in a day, 48 hours until you get to the cross. 48 hours for Jesus to do this. And along the way, we've said, if you want to save the world, there's some things you would be needing to do. You would need to be willing to pay the price. You'd need to be willing to go it alone. But today we're going to learn one final lesson in this series on saving the world in 48 hours. It's the title of our message today that says, "Don't expect support from the court of public opinion." This is the courtroom scene in Mark 15 where Jesus is going to be handed over by Caiaphas and the Jewish leadership to be tried before Pontius Pilate. Mark, for us, does not record all the events of the trial. You can look in the other Gospels and see there was more going on. For example, when Pilate had Jesus, he then handed him over to Herod, and Herod couldn't get him to do anything, and so he sent him back. There's more going on in the story, and so what we read today in Mark's Gospel was carefully selected so that we would understand the most important things that we needed to know. And so we pick up in chapter 15 in verse 1 with these final not just hours, but moments that will lead until the cross. In fact, by the time we're done reading these verses in just a moment, Jesus will be on his way to the cross. It says in chapter 15, verse 1, it was very early in the morning. That's because Roman trials happened early because Roman officials wanted to be done early. You got there before the sun came up often, and a Roman official liked to be done by noon. Some even like to be done by 10 o'clock in the morning. Some of you say, hey, I'd like to have a job where I could be done by 10 o'clock in the morning. That would be nice. But that's the way they did it. And so it was very early in the morning that the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. What Mark's doing for us here is he's telling us who hands Jesus over. Chief priests, meaning the high priestly family, Caiaphas and so on. The elders are the traditional leaders of Jerusalem. They're the heads of the important families. They're the aristocrats, the movers and shakers of Jerusalem. And the teachers of the law are those that are in the Bible called the grammatus, the scribes, those who are dedicated to the study of the good book and tell everybody else what it means. There's the scholars of the scripture. The Sanhedrin, of course, is the official legal authority, the justice system, the supreme court, SCOTUS in Jerusalem. In other words, this represents all of the religious and political and economic power of Judaism at the center of the Jewish world in Jerusalem. And they are the ones who make their plans, it says. And so they bound Jesus, and they led him away, and they handed him over to Pilate. This is not the first scene of Jesus being bound. Remember, he's arrested by Judas Iscariot, or led by Judas Iscariot into the Garden of Gethsemane, and they bind him, and they lead him to the trial. And at the trial, they spit on him, and they hit him. By the time Jesus is standing before Pilate, his face undoubtedly is bruised, his eyes are puffy, his lips swollen, broken, bleeding, his garments covered in human saliva. They handed him over. The word handed over, that phrase is one word in Greek, paradidomi. It is the same word that's used all through this scene, starting with Judas, who handed him over. It is translated often in the text as betrayal. He's betrayed by Judas. He's betrayed, and again, he's handed over and betrayed here by the Jewish leaders to Pilate. Pilate has a question. He says in verse 2, "Are you the king of the Jews?" My red letter Bible here, it says, "You have said so," Jesus replied. That's all that is in red letters in this scene. Jesus' only comment. The chief priests, in verse 3, it says, accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? What's lost on our ears here is the Roman mindset about crimes and trials. If you didn't have anything to say in your own defense at a trial, Romans assumed you were not innocent. They assumed you were guilty. And so it says, see how many things they're accusing you of? But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. And then Mark tells us something. He gives us some insight into something that we don't see quite the same anywhere else. It says in verse 6, now it was the custom at the festival. This is the Jewish festival of Passover. It was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising, and the crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them whatever he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. And Mark tells us, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests, they stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. An incredibly unusual turn of events. What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews? By the way, that could have been our sermon today. What then will you do with the one they call the King of the Jews? That's a question the text is asking of our lives. What are we going to do with this one King of the Jews? And their answer in verse 13. Their answer, this crowd, this same crowd who on Sunday had cried out, crown him king, as he rode in on Jerusalem on the donkey, they now shout, crucify him. Pilate asks what is a logical question. He says, why? What crime has he committed? But not responding to the question, the text says, they just shouted louder, crucify him. And wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. And he had Jesus flogged and handed over to be crucified. That's why I say to you, don't expect support from the court of public opinion if you want to save the world. Mark doesn't stop there, though. He tells us what happens when they hand him over, when he's flogged and beaten so mercilessly and then handed over to be crucified, that he's now in the hands of Roman soldiers, people who are not known for their kindness and leniency, men trained in brutality. It says in verse 16 that the soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, but Mark tells us it wasn't really the palace per se. The palace was a place where when the governor would come to town, because he didn't normally stay in Jerusalem, he would go into this place, what is called here by that famous Latin name, the Praetorium, it's what it's called. They called together the whole company of soldiers, and they put a purple robe on him. The purple fabric was expensive. It was the fabric worn by the wealthy or by the kings. They twisted together a crown of thorns. In other words, you're a king, here we're going to give you one, but it's going to be a crown of thorns, and they set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And again, they struck him on the head with a staff, and they spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him, and when they had mocked him and they took off the purple robe, one can imagine what searing pain went through the body of Jesus, whose back was so broken by the flogging at this moment. They put his clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. The story that will lead us to the cross starts in this final courtroom scene. It starts with Pilate trying Jesus and presenting him before us. Mark is like a great painter painting for us a canvas, like the one we see that was done by Antonius Cicero in 1871. This painting, which is simply known by the Latin name that's used in the gospel about him. It says, Ecce homo. Behold the man. This is Pilate's presentation to Jesus. To whom? To the crowd. To the crowd. What would you have me do with Jesus? The crowd has to answer that question. Now, like this great painter, Mark is painting for us a story. If you don't know this, the gospel writers are portrait writers in literary form. These are narratives that are driving climactically toward the moment of the cross. And like any great painter, the scene that is set before us is both a foreground and a background. And the background you start with first, and that's what Mark does. And he lays out for us the setting of this story. And so we start there with that question, what's the setting that's before us here? And Mark gives us details, like you're watching a television show or a great movie. You're reading a great book. So many times a storyteller, a writer, a movie maker will introduce you to the setting in which the story happens. Mark tells us what time it was. It was very early in the morning. It was very early in the morning. Some people weren't quite even awake yet, but Jesus had not slept at all. This was an unending night for Jesus that had started in Gethsemane and would never end until he would end his life at the cross. He also tells us, like a great writer does, like what motivates this moment, what leads to this moment. How did we get here? And we're told that the religious leaders had made a plan. Mark's not saying that by accident. He had already set this stage for us earlier in the gospel when he told us about Jesus' miracles and the things that Jesus would do and how the Pharisees had already decided they wanted Jesus to die. And as Jesus would teach on Tuesday, how they would plot and plan all day long, sending people before Jesus so they could gather information that they could then use as witnesses against him in his court case. And then he tells us what happened. They handed him over to Pilate. And that is the beginning of this scene for us. Everything, though, in this story is painting this kind of picture. And if I could, I would contrast it to our modern court systems in this country. You know, in our criminal justice system, you often see a picture, a portrait, a sculpture, often as well, with a woman whose face is covered by some kind of garment to cover her eyes, and then with scales in her hands holding them out as if to say, justice is being weighed on the basis of evidence blindly, so that simply the evidence makes the case, and there's the assumption of innocence. There's never been a case that's more in contrast to that, is there? In the case of Jesus, there was no interest in truth or evidence or justice. The trial was rigged from the beginning. The outcome was already determined. Everything was being orchestrated in such a way as to ensure that there would be no other course than Jesus would die on a cross. And so they handed him over to Pilate to make sure it would happen. It's in this moment, now it's the ball is in Pilate's court, to mix metaphors. He now has to make the determination, and to do so, he will ask Jesus various questions. But in Mark's recounting of the story, he's interested in only one question. So what's the question? In verses 2 through 5, but especially starting in verse 2, here is his question. Mark 15, verse 2 says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" I mean, there's a lot of questions I could ask you, but this is the one that really matters, asked Pilate. And Jesus said, "You've said so." Why does he say this? Well, if you think back to the trial that has just happened only hours earlier in front of the high priest, the trial that night in the high priest's home wasn't going well. They had brought person after person to bring accusations against Jesus. Well, he did this, and he said this, and he said this against the temple. But nobody would agree, and their testimonies didn't conflict. And it wasn't getting anywhere, and they were running out of night so that they could hand him over to Pilate the next day. And so the high priest himself stepped in and said, I'll ask the question. And you remember the question that he asked him? He asked him point blank, are you saying that you're the Messiah? Are you saying that you are the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? In order to understand those questions, because they're actually the same question, you have to know that in the Bible, there was a practice when somebody was installed into an important office, particularly a holy office. Prophets, priests, and kings were anointed with oil and poured oil on their heads. But if you go back and you read the Old Testament, you almost never see any prophet ever anointed. And you read about how priests are, but it's an initiatory rite as they enter into what they do, but they're never called the anointed. The title, the anointed, is a title that was used of the kings, particularly of Judea. Saul was a king of Israel, and so he was called the anointed. He died, and then David became. But after David, every descendant of David that would rule in Jerusalem, that would rule in Judea, who would become a king, would be anointed. And the Bible says that they would be called, like in Psalm 2, the anointed. In Hebrew, Hamashiach, or the Messiah. In Greek, the Christ. To call someone the Messiah, the Christ, was to use the language of the day to say that they are the King of the Jews. It's the same thing. And so to ask the question, are you the King of the Jews? Are you claiming to be this long sought after one who would rule, is a question that Pilate asks. But it is a question the Gospels have already given us an answer to. Every Christmas, we tell the stories of the birth of Jesus, nativity of Jesus. And one of the great stories is in Matthew. When Jesus is born in Bethlehem, there's some people who live out east, and they look up in the sky and they see a star. And they say, someone has been born. And they travel on a long journey. These wise guys from the east travel west. And they come to Judea. They're called magi. We get the word magicians from that. They're sort of astrologers. And when they get there, do you remember where they go? They don't go to Bethlehem. They go to Jerusalem, the capital city. They stand in front of the king, Herod the Great, and they ask this question in Matthew 2:2. This is their question. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him. Where's the one who's been born King of the Jews? Now, to Herod's ears, that was an offensive way to say something, because Herod was Idumean and he wasn't Jewish. He had no divine right to that position. He had gotten there through plot, through his connections with the Roman government, by willing to kill anyone along the way. But Jesus, the Gospels tell us, was born King of the Jews. He didn't become king by some placement, by some official designation. He was born that way by his ancestry through all the way back to David, and by his heavenly ancestry as the Son of God. He is the one who is King of the Jews. Pilate's question, therefore, has such an interesting answer. And it's interesting, too, because Pilate has come to his position as the Roman governor of this region, not by some birth or some divine appointment. He's gotten it because he's of a wealthy family. He's of equestrian rank. If you rank the people in the Roman society, the highest class of Rome were the senators. They were the uber wealthy. They were the modern billionaires. And just beneath them were the knights, the equestrians, those who were rich enough to own a horse and ride it. Pilate was one of those. He had been appointed the governor in this region, and he ruled it. He had the power of life and death. Every once in a while, you're working in the Bible and preaching, and people come to you and they say, how do I know any of these things are true? How do I know these events actually happened? Well, I can tell you that in 1961, when they were digging along the coast of the Mediterranean, at the site of where Pilate's city was, the city built literally on the sea by Herod the Great, Caesarea Maritima. It was the seaport. It was the mega center of all Roman life in Israel. It's where Pilate lived. There were hippodromes, there were horse races, and there was amphitheaters where people would sit and watch the games. In 1961, they found this stone. Now that stone up on that big screen behind me looks like it's larger than life, but it's actually just the size of a stone that you would sit on if you were sitting in a Roman amphitheater. And that's exactly what it was. It was a seat that the governor sat on, and it has his name on it. Now some of you really like to go to shows or watch various sports. Maybe you like it so much you've taken out where you can go anytime you want. You have a season pass. You can sit in your seat whenever it is your game, but I mean, even the best seats I know of don't have what Pilate's seat has. Has his name on it, literally. It says when he had it inscribed, to the divine Augustus, who had this Tiberius, who was ruling at the time. Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, that was his title in those days. Later it was called procurator. Today we just call it a governor. Has dedicated this. Josephus tells us that, as I said to you, Pilate was of an equestrian, he was from the Ponti family. The word Pontius is his family name. It is his last name. It was what he was known as. He was a Ponti. And he came to this position under the authority of the Roman Senate and under the authority of the emperor himself. And he would succeed one after the other, different ones who would rule. He succeeded Valerius Gratus as the prefecture in 26. He would be followed up later by a man named Cuspius Fadus in 44. But in the ensuing years in which Josephus ruled, that Pilate ruled, Josephus tells us that he was an evil man, that he was harsh. He was so harsh that the Romans actually pulled him from his assignment and brought him back to Rome. He was ruthless and corrupt. He could be bought off with the littlest amount of money. He was a wicked man, and that's what makes this scene so incredible. Jesus is standing in front of Pilate, a man who didn't care too much for any human life, much less the life of a Jew. Wants nothing more in this moment, it seems, but to let Jesus off. When the officials bring him to him, he says, how can I get out of this? How can I let this guy go? The question that he asks in this moment is this: are you the king of the Jews? And I think the reason that Pilate was asking this question in his own mind is because he didn't think he was. In fact, he didn't even believe that Jesus was claiming to be. And if you stop and you think about it, you would know why. If someone was claiming to be a king in this land of Judea, they always did one thing. They would get together a group of militia and they would launch some kind of rebellion. The question is, if Jesus is trying to be a king, where's his army? What battles has he fought? What uprisings have taken place? Where has he claimed to be king? Where are the followers of his that are claiming him to be the king? Every indication in the Gospels is that he never did that. He told his guys to put away their swords. And not only that, but if you were trying to be a king, you were trying to aspire to this high political office, wouldn't you, instead of offending all of the authorities, wouldn't you come in and kind of do what modern day politicians do? Like, hey, vote for me. He didn't do that. He didn't go before Caiaphas and say, support me in my effort to become king. There were no political ads running through the streets of Jerusalem saying, Jesus, king this year. It was obvious to anyone observing that Jesus wasn't doing this thing that he was being accused of, and even to this cold-hearted Roman governor. It was obvious that Jesus was innocent of this charge. In fact, so what he does is he wants to try to find a way out of this. He's got a bit of a problem. Everybody that's in power wants Jesus dead. And he's got to figure out, how do I not convict an innocent man? So what's the solution? In verse 6 of this passage, we're told something that's really interesting. It says in Mark 15, verse 6, it says, "Now there was a custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested." It's like this: if it's this time of the year, we're going to let somebody go who was, a bad guy this year. We're going to let him out. Just tell us who you want out, and we'll let him out. To me, this kind of practice reminds me of what happens every Thanksgiving at the White House when the president gets on television and there's all these turkeys and he pardons the Thanksgiving turkey, It's like, well, this turkey's not going to have to be on the dinner table. It's a release of someone who would otherwise have experienced something. It's a strange practice, and yet in this story, Pilate brings it up because he's hoping for what? He's hoping that the crowd will say, yeah, release Jesus. Maybe they think he's guilty, but we're going to let him go. I call this practice the religious exchange program. But it doesn't turn out that way, does it? And this is why I say to you, if you want to save the world, don't expect the support from the court of public opinion. Because what the crowd asks for is Barabbas. In one of the Gospels, he's called Jesus Barabbas. Bar means son in Hebrew, like bar mitzvah is the son of the law. Barabbas was the son of Abbas. His most normal name was Jesus, which was a bit of irony, isn't it? The crowd says, give us the Barabbas, give us the guy that had been involved in an actual insurrection, a guy who was an actual criminal, a guy that actually, by Roman law, should have been crucified. And in his place, let Jesus go to the cross. Something worth thinking about, though, is why were these religious leaders so hell-bent, if you would, on sending Jesus to a cross? I mean, have you ever wondered that? Have you never said to yourself, why didn't they just do to Jesus what they all do to Stephen in the book of Acts? They get mad, the Sanhedrin picks up a rock, and they just start beating him to death. Why didn't they stone him in the streets of Jerusalem? Why drag him before the Roman government? Why go through this big thing? And the answer is, they didn't want to kill him. They wanted the Romans to humiliate him. They wanted him to die in the most horrible fashion that had ever been invented by human beings. In Roman law and Roman custom, a Roman citizen could never be crucified. Only the slaves and the lowest classes of society in the Roman world could be subjected to this form of death, so painful and unbearable that it just is called excruciating, out of Latin for out of the cross. It's not just the horror of the suffering, the passion that Jesus would endure, but its purpose in this culture was to humiliate. This ancient culture was a society built on what we call shame and honor. People wanted honor above anything. They would die for their honor beyond anything else. But to be shamed in death in this humiliating way, to be crucified naked and broken on a cross beside the road as passers-by and the crowds would be able to hurl insults. That's what they wanted. They didn't just want Jesus to die. They wanted to bring him down and crush him completely in utter contempt. And they knew something. They knew the fickle nature of a crowd. Now, this is a stirring moment, and I think it's, when I read this text, I can't help but feel like I'm looking into a little bit of a human mirror here as we're seeing our own selves, because on Sunday, this same crowd that had cried, "Crown him king," as he rode in on the donkey would cry, "Crucify him." Now, mind you, we don't know who was in this crowd, but undoubtedly this massive crowd of people, this throng of people that was there, were made up of people who had been involved in Jesus' ministry. Some of them, maybe, who were crying, "Crucify him," had eaten some of the bread that he had multiplied on the hillsides. Some of them maybe had brought their sons and their daughters to him to be healed. Some of them had maybe even said, "We want to follow you," or even been baptized. And now, stirred up by a crowd, they cry, "Crucify him." They knew how easy it would be to turn this crowd against him, and so that's what they do. All through this series on saving the world in 48 hours, I've said things like, if you want to save the world, you got to be willing to go it alone. And in this moment, Jesus is alone. It's actually amazing, isn't it? Every really good movie we've ever watched, there's a scene like this. There's a court scene. When I was a kid, and this will kind of time date me a little bit, though, I always really enjoyed watching like the old Matlock shows, you know, the lawyer who would come in and he would figure out the case at the end. Or I'd even watch some of the old Perry Mason. In these shows and in movies, at the very end, when everything seems hopeless, all hope is gone, the case is over, some new evidence is introduced, and suddenly the whole case changes in a new direction. We're coming to the end of it, and we're expecting someone to come out of the woodwork and go, "Well, wait a minute, you forgot about this," and Jesus walks out free. But there's no one there. Mark doesn't tell us waiting over in the corner is even Peter. Where's John? Where are all those people? Where are the throngs and the throngs of people that have been associated with Jesus' ministry all along? Where are they when he needs them most? And the answer in this story is they're part of this mob. They're part of this crowd that is joining in, saying, "Crucify him." I say that to you because, again, the message today is called, "Don't expect support from the court of public opinion." And if I could say this to us in our lives today, we cannot expect this world that we are living in, this culture that we are living in, to applaud what we are doing today. We cannot expect that the world that we live in is going to support us in following Jesus Christ. We can't expect that. In fact, the truth is, more often than not, they won't. They will be a part of those who oppose and would seek to humiliate us. But if you want to save the world, and that's when we come to this moment where we realize that although this story seems tragic to us, although this story seems like the worst of the worst, this was all a part of God's plan to do exactly that, to save the world. This was God's plan to rescue you and me. And hidden in this story about Barabbas is you and me, isn't it? Because Jesus Christ took Barabbas' place at the cross in the same way that Jesus Christ took your place and mine. He went through all of this. He paid the price. He was willing to go it alone. He was willing to hear the crowd cry, "Crucify him," and the humiliation of the cross, because he so passionately and desperately wanted to save you that he died for you. He took your place. The Bible describes this in so many different ways. One is it says that God so loved us, he sent his only begotten Son. And then doesn't stop there to say that he sent us to save us, but it tells us that today we can hear that message and walk out of here knowing the good news, but have never made it real for us. And the gospel says, and therefore what we need to do with that is we need to put our faith in him. Because God loved us so much that he gave his own Son, that whoever believes in him. You got to believe in him. You got to trust in him. There has to be a moment when you defy the crowd and you walk the lonely road of faith and you commit your heart completely to Jesus Christ. Has there been a place and time in your life when you've done that? Somebody in this room, those of you watching, we call this our invitation. And today, we walk with Jesus from Pilate's hall down that lonely road to the cross, knowing that it is the road to our salvation. Would you pray with me? Lord, it is incredible to read this story, the greatest story that's ever been told. It is the story of your death, and it is the story of our salvation. It is the story of your humiliation. It is the story of our glory. It is the story of your death for our sin, your pain for our eternal paradise, your hurt for our heaven. Lord, it is the story of what you did for us so we wouldn't have to go down this road. But Lord, this is also a story that is just a story until it becomes our story. And so today, God, my prayer is that as I've shared this great story, that someone here today, someone watching, would be ready to make this their story. To say that today is a day that I want to put my faith and my trust in Jesus Christ, the one who was willing to go the lonely road to the cross, through the darkness of Gethsemane, through the dark night of the soul and the loneliness of the court of Pilate, and all the way to the cross. And so, Lord, today, in this hour, in this moment, when the time is running out, the time is running out for our lives to make a decision for you, I pray that right now, everyone who can would choose you. And I pray it in Jesus' name.